Hello, and welcome to Alyssa Jean's Reviews, and welcome to my review of Star Trek Strange New Worlds Season 2, Episode 3, Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow, because it's a time travel episode in Star Trek, and let's just throw out the word tomorrow a bunch of times, because that's how Star Trek does it with time travel episodes. Almost all of them have either the word tomorrow, yesterday, future, or past in the title. But title aside, I did really love this episode. But before I can get into any of the details, just the standard spoiler warning. If you have not seen this episode, then you should not be watching this video. And I've already spoiled it that it's a time travel episode if somehow you live in a cave and missed that. So if you haven't seen the episode, go watch it first and then come back and watch my video. So now with that out of the way, this is my favorite episode of the season. With all due respect to last week's episode, I did enjoy last week's episode. Just maybe not quite as much as others did. I heard it hailed as one of the best episodes of Strange New Worlds, one of the best episodes of Modern Trek, and blah, blah, blah. I really liked it. I love that they tackled important issues, especially as related to me and the LGBTQ community in the present day. I thought they did a great job. As far as trial episodes goes, it was a pretty strong one. I just don't like the trial episode format, and I did find some nitpicks and some contrivances, which seem to bother no one else, but maybe it's just my prejudice against trial episodes. I don't know, my bias against trial episodes. I still give it an 8. I still really liked it. Don't get me wrong. I love the episode. Maybe not quite as much as other people, so I feel like I may be the only one in the universe who says this. This week's episode was definitely a lot stronger. I'm sure I'm the only one who says this, but I loved this episode. And I think whereas last week's was a trial episode, this was a time travel episode. And I'm always a sucker for good time travel episodes. And this was a good one. Star Trek oftentimes, even in some of my favorite time travel episodes, such as Past Tense and Deep Space Nine, they really screw up the time travel logic. And there's other episodes which I don't like, such as Relativity, which I'll mention later in this video. The time travel logic is just all over the place and makes no sense. This one, the time travel logic seems pretty sound to me. I don't know if other people will point out some time travel logic flaws that I missed, but I didn't catch any. I thought it was pretty sound time travel logic. I thought, just as usual with Strange New Worlds, this episode was well written. And once again, Strange New Worlds does something and they do it well. So whatever they attempt to do, they do it really well. Last week's trial episode, they did a really good trial episode. They're doing time travel. They're doing a really good time travel episode. So this is the second time that we have seen Paul Wesley as James Kirk, and it's the second time that we're seeing an alternate timeline version of Kirk, a different alternate timeline version of Kirk than the one we saw before. Now, we did finally get regular Prime Timeline Lieutenant Kirk at the end of the episode, and we will get Prime Timeline Lieutenant Kirk in an upcoming episode. I'm not sure which one, but I know that the critics have seen it because I've heard about it. And we see in the preseason trailer, there's a scene with Kirk sitting with Uhura, and I think they're toasting each other. We haven't seen that yet. So that's pretty sure is going to be actual Prime Timeline Lieutenant Kirk. So we are eventually going to get an episode with him in it. But here we get the second version of an alternate timeline Kirk. And the chemistry between Leon and Kirk was on point. I mean, it's not, Edith Keeler and Kirk type chemistry, but nothing is. But the actors work really well together. The relationship that they develop over the course of this hour is really believable and feels real. So that aspect was good. But the strongest aspect of this episode, which I'll get into more detail as I get into more of the review, is Leon's character story. This is bar none the best Leon episode in Strange New Worlds so far, because they're finally getting away from, last season they were stuck in this Gorn thing where that's was her whole character trait, was wanting revenge against the Gorn and being afraid of the Gorn and being sad about her brother. And that was her whole deal. And finally, we move away from that and address the elephant in the room, which is her freaking name, which they did not address barely at all last season, and was finally addressed last week during the trial. And I do think, unfortunately, that does, I don't know, end up reflecting poorly on this episode, because I wish they had built that up more. When I'll get into that later in this video. But that's really, other than the title, the only flaw I can think of in this episode is that they should have built, previous to this episode, they really should have built up her relationship to her name and how it really bothers her, and how she hates having that name and that legacy that comes with it. But I love that they tackled it in this episode. And the ending, and when we find out what they really went back there for, so good. Such a strong character episode for Leon. So good. And when at the end, when she calls up Kirk and she's in tears, this is so good. This is what Strange New Worlds does really well. With their previous timey-wimey episode last season, Equality of Mercy, one that also had Kirk in it, that was a very strong Pike episode. This time they're using time travel. They're kind of timey-wimey episodes as a really strong Leon episode, and one of the strongest character episodes overall in Strange New Worlds to this point. Okay, so let me go ahead and get into more of the details of this episode. Okay, so we get a little bit of an intro showing Leon's daily activities and like kind of what state of mind she's in. We see that with her sprawl with Mabamba, and then we immediately get into the scene that you've already seen if you are like me and watch the sneak peek scene, or if you're like me and you watch it like 5 or 6, 7, 8 times, which is when Leon encounters the time traveler. Now, I do want to mention him because he shows Leon this little holographic image, and there's this image that appears that it's kind of like it's a big oval, and it's got like a timeline thing in it. So I was watching this video of these dudes who were breaking down the sneak peek before the episode aired, and they zoomed in on that, and they looked at an image from the Star Trek Voyager episode Relativity, like standing behind the time travel dudes when they were on their time travel ship. If you zoom in, it's the same exact image, so therefore these are the same dudes from Star Trek Voyager. And I think they do, at the end when that lady comes in, she says what organization she's from, and I guess it's probably the same one that they said in Voyager. I don't actually remember the temporal, whatever they are, temporal Starfleet. I forget what they were called. But I think we are to assume that these are the same dudes from Voyager, or at least the same agency from Star Trek Voyager, except this time they don't have really ridiculously bad time travel logic. This time it makes a lot more sense. So at first I was wondering why this time traveler went to Leon, particularly did he just happen to go to the Enterprise, and why was he there? But I think it's clear by the end of the episode that he does specifically seek out Leon because of who she is, and that she's a ancestor of Khan. But not only an ancestor of Khan, but one that is a good person. Presumably him, and from his future perspective, would be able to go back and see that Leon did a lot of great things and was a really good person. So he chose her as Khan's descendant to go back on this mission when he was in a state of desperation. He's like, oh, I got to go somewhere and get somebody to fix this. I'll go get Leon Noonien Singh. And this is all well and good with me. I have no issues with this. I think this works. At the end of the episode, that lady was like, well, I didn't send you anywhere. I mean, yeah, technically, but your colleague did, so come on. Anyways, so then when the time travel disappears, you see this light go down the hallway. That's when the timeline changes. And then you see her go to the bridge, and there is Kirk. And this is when we have the opening credits. Now, this would be a Yesterday's Enterprise-esque kind of surprise, like when all of a sudden Worf is gone and we see Tasha Yar. It would be if I didn't watch the sneak peek like 6 or 7 times. It is not, because I've already seen it. That's my own fault, I suppose. But now, how is Kirk captain in this timeline already? I don't know. Maybe he just went up the ranks faster in the Earth fleet than he did in Starfleet. That's fine. So I don't have no complaints about that. Either I'm fine with it. Then of course we have Leon and Kirk end up going back in time. So we get them traveling back in time, and as they are walking around and bantering and talking and whatnot, we get more information on Kirk's timeline. Now, we've gotten a little bit on the ship. We see this alternate Captain Spock, and it looks like the Vulcans and the humans are completely separate, and Kirk's like, sorry, we can't help you. Looks like that they are both separately in a war with the Romulans. So we get that, but here we get that Earth is not habitable in Kirk's time, and that he was born in space, ironically on the USS Iowa. And now we get some context for a scene we all saw in the preseason trailer and went, what? What the fuck is he talking about? So they go into that department store, and Kirk is having a hard time with the revolving door, and Leon is like, what, you've never seen a revolving door before? And he's like, I was born in space. And everyone was like, what is he talking about? He was born in Iowa. Why is he saying that? That doesn't make any sense. Now we see it's an alternate timeline version of Kirk who was born in space. We're like, oh, okay, that makes sense. So they do the very typical, we have to get clothes thing that all time travelers must do. And then they need to figure out what the hell they're there for. And I found this to be really interesting because they don't have Ziggy, they don't have Al coming through the holographic door to tell them, well, the probability of this is this and this. Nor do they have any devices, no tricorder, no communicator, no nothing. Oftentimes in Star Trek, they do have a ship's computer, or they do have some way of finding out something, or they just are a history buff and they just know, like Cisco already knew about Gabriel Bell, and then when Gabriel Bell gets killed, it's like, oh fuck, this wasn't supposed to happen. So he already knew that. So usually in Star Trek, they do already know what the deal is. Whereas here, they had no idea. And I really liked the mystery, and I liked the resolution to the mystery that we will get later on. But in the meantime, while they are trying to figure this out, this is when they are gradually, starting to get to know each other, and that's where this chemistry between the two actors really comes into play. I think the whole scene with the hot dogs was very cute. I think also, to me, I felt very Kirk. By the way, I'm just going to slip this in now. I loved Paul Wesley as Kirk in the previous episode he was in, and I love him as Kirk here. I do not want nor expect a William Shatner impersonation. I don't think that would work. I think Paul Wesley is putting his own spin on Kirk, and I think it is really working and really feels like Kirk for me, even if it is an alternate version of Kirk. Anyways, so this is happening, and then they meet a mysterious photographer girl who appears to be wanting to help them out. Actually, I was about to get into the Romulan Girl, but let me actually take a step back first and talk about Pelia, and then I'll get into the Romulan Girl, because I'm a little iffy on Pelia, honestly. I liked her in her first appearance in episode 1, but I don't know how she's going to fit in this show. And I'm thinking actually more about the scene at the beginning of the episode where Leon is confronting her about stealing all this art or whatever. And It felt more like Lower Decks than Strange New Worlds. She feels like a Lower Decks character. Also, I can't understand what the fuck she's saying half the time. I think the accent is a little bit too much. So I am a little iffy on this character, although I had no problem with her in these past scenes. I thought that all worked. But I'm keeping my eye out on this character moving forward. I think she could appear in Lower Decks because she lives for thousands of years. So there could definitely be a cartoon version of her in season 4 of Lower Decks, and she'd fit right in. But in any case, now I'll get back to the Romulan girl. I did have a little bit of an issue with her being a Romulan. I guess she did say she'd been on Earth for 30 years. She looks like she can't be much older than 30, but Romulans do have longer lifespans. So maybe she's acclimated, and maybe that's why she behaved the way that she did. So I'll just go ahead and go along with that. Now, I want to point out some dialogue that I have a feeling other people might try to point out as a plot hole, but it's not a plot hole. And that's the fact that Kirk seems to know what Romulans look like. And he says to her, oh, nice disguise. And she says, well, the ears this is the hardest part to get used to, or something like that. Now, Leon wouldn't know what a Romulan looks like. Leon, hearing this, would go, oh, I guess Romulans have different ears or something. I don't know. But if you think Kirk wouldn't know, I think you would be mistaken, because this is not the prime timeline Kirk. This is an alternate timeline Kirk. And in his timeline, they are in active war with the Romulans. It's not like the off-screen computer war that is described in Balance of Terror that happened in the past. This seems to be a direct war in which Kirk would definitely know what the Romulans look like. So he would know that they look like Vulcans in this alternate timeline version of Kirk. So that is not a plot hole. Don't let anyone tell you that it is. Then Kirk gets shot and killed, which I think was really the only way that you could do this to have that actually work out. Because Leon's like, oh, why don't you come back to my time? And he's like, well, they can't. The one timeline isn't big enough for two of me, and like they couldn't do that. And you couldn't necessarily leave him alive in the past, because that could have ripple effects. We've already seen this happen in Star Trek, where an alternate version of Tasha Yar goes back in time and has a kid that's half Romulan, who ends up being an evil mustache twirly villain. So if you leave alternate timeline Kirk in the past, then he still exists, because this is what happened with Tasha Yar. He wouldn't just disappear. He would still exist, because this is the precedent Star Trek has set. So he could have ripple effects in the timeline if he were to stay behind. So he can't go back to the present. He can't stay back there. So really the only logical story resolution for him is to die. So that made a lot of sense to me. I do wonder, like, what about his remains? Like, they find his remains and are like, who is this dude? Like, there's no record of him. I had this crazy thought. You know how everybody was making a big deal about Star Trek Picard Season 3, how Section 31 had Kirk's remains? Is there any chance that it's not the Kirk remains from Star Trek Generations, but it's this Kirk remains, the alternate timeline Kirk? Probably not, right? Because how would they know? Like, it would be from 200 years earlier. Like, how would they know it's an alternate timeline Kirk? Maybe they would do a DNA test and like, oh, this is Kirk somehow. I don't know. I'm just throwing that out there. That would be a cool crossover if it was. And it would make more sense than them having Star Trek Generation Kirk's bones. But anyways, it might have been established that it was that version of Kirk. I don't know. Anyways, just a thought. So now we build up to the final confrontation, and we find out what this is really about, which is killing Khan, which has a negative effect on the future and causes the Federation to no longer exist and makes it easier for the Romulans. So apparently they ran these simulations to see what might happen if certain things were changed. And they discovered, well, if we kill Khan, that actually negatively affects the timeline. And now we got a seed planted earlier, a very interesting character moment when Kirk didn't know the name Noonan Singh. And now, when that happened, my assumption was, oh, so whatever changes before the eugenic wars, so the eugenic wars don't end up happening. Now, remember, Star Trek Strange New Worlds Season 1 established that Star Trek has repurposed the eugenic wars they've moved them to the mid-21st century, and not the 1990s, where the wars they originally stated was in the 90s, because that's just silly. The eugenic wars did not happen in the 90s. So, A Strange New Worlds Season 1, Episode 1, Pike is giving a little speech to those people and giving a history lesson about the Earth, and shows January 6th, and shows, a civil war. And then he says, then the eugenic wars happened. So, eugenic wars have already been moved in canon to the 21st century, which makes a lot more sense than the 90s. So when they had that initial line about Kirk not recognizing her name, I just assumed that, oh, whatever changes happens before the eugenic wars. But no, it turns out that the change is preventing the eugenic wars, which actually has a very negative effect. So this is really powerful. On a global scale, it's kind of like the global version of Tapestry, whereas in the episode Tapestry of the Next Generation, Picard had this event that happened in his life that he thought was a very negative one. He was very ashamed of, where he got in a fight with the Norsikins and got his heart cut and had to get an artificial heart. And it turns out, if you take that away, it has a very negative effect on his life. This is a more global scale. That it turns out, if you take away the eugenic wars, there's no Federation. Now, they don't go into detail as to, they don't spell it all out for you, but it's just more of a general sense that after the eugenic wars, after humanity was at its lowest, it was able to recover from that and create this utopia. And that's enough for me. I don't need for them to spell it out. Well, after the eugenic wars, this happened, and then this happened, and this happened, and that's why the Federation exists. And wouldn't exist if there were no eugenic wars. I don't need it all spelled out for me like that. So that worked, and I found that to be very powerful. And then the other episode I would compare this to is Sitting on the Edge of Forever, because this is kind of the reverse Edith Keeler. So Edith Keeler was a very kind and loving person who Kirk was in love with, who had to die in order for the timeline to be maintained. Whereas here, Khan is an awful, horrible, terrible person who murders millions, who has to live in order for the timeline to be maintained. And more than that, it has a personal connection to Leanne. Leanne has gone her whole life with that name, with the shame of that name. I don't know why she couldn't change it, but she has this name, and she has to carry this through her whole life. Now, this is where I wish they had built this up more in season 1. We barely heard anything about this in season 1. I'm pretty sure we didn't get anything until last week's episode. So I wish they had built this up more, because it would have made this even more powerful than it was. But it still works. It still works for me that Leanne, of course, would struggle her whole life living under the shadow of that awful name. So it's a very personal connection that she could wipe out. And she's even offered, you know what, you've got that little device that protects you from the timeline, so you would still exist, but you could exist with no one knowing your name. Doesn't that sound great? And she does stop and think about it for a second, and it's very tempting. And then there's a scene where, there's this little kid, and she's like, he's going to be a fucking monster, but he's a little kid. And now this scene reminded me of the old adage. I'm sure you've all heard this before, the old thing, like this hypothetical scenario that, popular for people to bring up. If you could go back in time and kill baby Hitler, would you do it? And I think this episode is saying, no, you should not do that. Not just because, we're talking about baby murder, like what's wrong with you people, but also, let's say even like you could kill Hitler's mom before she gives birth or whatever. You don't know what kind of long-term effects that's going to have on the timeline. It could make things worse. So it's better just to like let things play out the way that they played out and not fuck with the timeline. And I think that's what this episode is saying. But it was a really powerful way of doing it because of the really strong personal connection that it has to Leon and how she struggled. And she actually did seem to think for a second about, well, wouldn't that be nice, actually, if I could just exist in this timeline where nobody knows my name? But she had to think about, like, but the Federation wouldn't exist. And so ultimately she does do the right thing. But you could see the wheels turning. You can see that was a tough choice and super powerful. Really, really good. Really, really good. All right, let me go ahead now. This is an extra long video by my standards, so let me go ahead and wrap this thing up with my rating out of 10. Okay, so each week I give a rating out of 10, with 1 being the lowest possible score, 10 being the highest possible score. And my rating for season 2, episode 3 of Strange New Worlds, tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow, I think I'm going to go 9. A 10 is very tempting here, but I don't know. I need to let this sit with me a little bit before I'm ready to go 10. And you know what? By the end of the season or by next year, I could watch this episode a couple more times and decide that it's a 10. I did this with the Lower Decks episode. I'm actually right now in the middle of my rewatch of Star Trek Lower Decks season 3, and there's an episode there, Here All Trust Nothing. It's the Deep Space Nine episode that I initially gave a 9, and I think even before the season was over, I was already thinking that was a mistake. And when I just did my rewatch, I was like, oh no, this is definitely a 10. So I think that this episode has a chance to fall in that category as well. But I think for now, I'm going to go with a very, very strong 9. So that is my rating for this episode, my favorite episode of the season so far, with all due respect to last week's episode. All right, everyone, thank you so much for watching. Please join me again and next week as I talk about season 3 season 2 episode 4. I was getting conflated with my Lower Deck season 3 comment that I just made. Season 2, episode 4, Star Trek Strange New Worlds. I will be here to review it. I don't know why I'm talking like William Shatner all of a sudden. All right, everybody. I'll see you then. Goodbye.